Hey everyone, and welcome back to the second part of our video on how to make a to-do app using Bloc and Hive. Today's video was made possible by our two Buy Me a Coffee supporters for this month, Joe and Pankaj. Your support means I can keep making videos like this about Flutter and Bloc and other topics that you'd like to learn about. So it's really good to see. Of course, because this video is part 2, it won't make much sense if you haven't seen part 1. So you should go and watch that now if you haven't already. Where we left off last time, we had a to-do app, but it wasn't very useful. We couldn't tick off to-dos and new users couldn't create an account, for instance. But it did give us an idea of how Flutter Bloc works and how we can use it to create an app like a to-do app. Today, we'll round out that example by adding functionality to create new accounts, and also tick off to-do items that have already been done, as well as creating new to-dos. Where we need to, we'll persist this data back to our Hive database. We'll also use dialog boxes, and we'll see how we can pass the information from these dialog boxes into our app. We've got a bit to cover, so let's go ahead and get into it. So where we left off is we had our little to-do app with our login screen, and as we could see, if we logged into our app, then we would have some to-dos, but we couldn't interact with them just yet. So in this video, we'll make them interactable, and we'll also add a little registration option on this main screen, which will let us create new users and add them to our app. So let's get to work on creating that registration screen. The first thing we need to do is make some changes to our authentication class that'll let us create these new users and add them to the Hive database. So I'll open up authentication.dart, and we'll go down the bottom, and we'll create a new function. So we'll create a new function here, feature, let's call it create user. And I'll take parameters of username and also of type password. We'll make it asynchronous as well. So creating a user can have a couple of different results. It can either be successful or it can fail for some reason. One of the reasons for failure is if a user already exists with a name like that. So to capture that, outside this class, what I'll do is I'll set up an enum and I'll call it user creation result, and it can have either case of success, failure, or already exists. And then I'll make this feature return this user creation result. So the first thing in this function we would like to check is if there's already a user with this username in the database. So I'll make a new variable, call it already exists, and I'll go users values any element username, and I'll also add to lowercase on that, and I'll go equals to username to lowercase, and a comma there as well. So just breaking this down briefly, the any function here will operate on an iterable, and it will check to see if any of the elements in the collection satisfy this condition. So we're interested in if any of the usernames already in the database already have this username. The second thing that's pretty important is we also want to check not only if these usernames already exist, but we want to compare based on the lowercase version of these usernames. The reason for this is because a username should be unique regardless of the casing. If someone comes along and sets up an account with Roger and makes an account, and the second person comes along and makes another account with Roger with a capital R, they shouldn't have two different accounts. They should get the same failure to say there's already an account exists with that name. So because any returns a boolean, which is true or false, we can say if already exists, so there already is someone in there with that name, and then we can just return the appropriate user creation result, which is already exists. And that's where that particular bit of code would exit, because we've satisfied that condition. So continuing on from this point, if there isn't an account already created with this name. So based on that, we can now try. So adding in our new user here, you can see we've got our username and our password, and that will take care of adding us into that database. After this, because it's succeeded, we can return the user creation result success. We can also catch any exceptions that have come about in this process. And if it hasn't worked for now, then we'll just return user creation failure if there's any failure that's occurred and the user account hasn't been created. And we'll just go ahead and save that. So now coming back into our home.dart, This is the main screen that people see when they first open up the application, which of course looks like this. So because on our page here, we already have a login button, the easiest thing we could do for this sample would be to create another button with register on it, that if people were to click, then it would let them create that new account. Ideally, we'd have the register button next to it because that would look a bit more normal. So we'll come into our elevator button here. We'll wrap this in a row because we're laying things out left to right. And next to it, we'll put an elevator button. Leave that blank for now. Text, register. And that looks, and they're side by side, but the alignment's all wrong. So we'll come back into our row and we'll make the main axis alignment, which is the main axis of our row, which will be left to right in this instance. Just go center. And as well as that, we'll just add some padding on these buttons. And that's starting to look a little bit more believable. So now we've done all that, now it's time to set up our register event, which will actually take care of creating this account. So go into home event, I'll create another event called register account event. Extends home event. For this, we'll need our username and also our password. We'll go ahead and we'll create the overrides for those. And we'll add the username and password to the properties check for equality before finally adding these to the constructor. Coming back to our block now for this event, we can see we have our old event here, the login event. So just underneath that, we'll add a new event in and we'll call it register event, register account event. I realize I've actually typoed that, so I'll go back and I'll fix that first. Register account event, emit. While I'm here, I actually want to call out a mistake I made on the previous video. It must have been tired or something. Within this block, we can see that we have our previous event handlers. We have event, and then we have emitter. Now, emitter is actually totally wrong. We shouldn't have that there, because what's happening is we're having our event here, and then we're calling emit, which is actually calling emit out of the base class, which is not what we want. We actually get a warning for it now. It says that we can't use emit here. We should only be using this within a test. The warning may not have been there last time, but to fix it, we should just change all these to emit, and that'll make that warning go away. Coming back into our event here, we'd like to go get the result of our authentication service. Event, username, event, password. We also want to make this asynchronous and then await the result of that. So because we use that enum, we can actually write a switch statement on the result. And if we just write that and leave it alone, Android Studio will actually highlight it. If we hit that and then click on the light bulb, we have this add missing case clauses. And it's really cool because what it will do is it will generate the code for every possible case within that enum. So if it's successful, then like before, we'd just like to emit that successful login state. And we can do that here. Emit successful login state with the username that was created. If it hasn't worked because there's been some failure or because the username already exists, we'd like to indicate that back up to the user. So to do that, we'll come back into our home state and we can see here that we have our home initial, which doesn't really do anything. What we'd like to do is we'd like to add to this a nullable string which will contain our error text. So I'll add that to the constructor and also add it to there as well. Because error can be null, we just want to wrap it in these curly brackets to make the parameter optional. What we'll be doing is if this string isn't null, then we'll assume that an error has taken place and then show that to the user. So we'll come back into that block, and if there's been a failure, then we can emit the home initial state and give an error and just say there's been an error. Of course, it's probably pretty rare that we'd actually ever see that because Hive's pretty simple in how it adds to the database, but still it's a good idea to catch exceptions if they ever could exist. We'll get rid of the handler's case. And in the case it already exists, then we'll emit the home initial state again with the error, and also user already exists. And that's our block figured out. So let's now apply these changes to the UI. So coming into home.dart, up the top here, from before we have our block consumer, which listens to the block and can make decisions on navigation and things like that for us. We're only doing something though if there's been a successful login. So just underneath this, I'll add another new statement and we'll just check if it's the home initial state. And if the error isn't null, then we would like to show a dialog. We'll use the context, and we'll just use an alert dialog. Flutter comes with a bunch of dialogs like alert dialog, simple dialog. So in this case, we'll just use alert dialog. Title, just error. And as well as that, as the content, we'll just reference the error message itself. Now what's going to happen is that even though we've done this little null check down here, Flutter will still complain because it thinks that this value could be null. But if we hover over it, it will say to us that it knows that it's not meant to be null, but it can't promote it. So, and we can read that document if we want to. So we're safe to go ahead and add an exclamation point to say that we definitely know that state.error is not going to be null because we've literally just checked that it's not null. So we'll go ahead and we'll save that. The last thing we'll do is finally wire up that registration button to send the event into the block to tell it to register the new account. So to do that, we'll just type in block provider of, and we're sending this into the home block, and we'll add in the register account event, which takes username and password. So just be the username field text, and also password field text. And now with that done, we can come back to our app, create a new username, give it a password if we want to, and hit register. And we've actually created a new account within the app, which is good, but we don't have any to-dos in here yet. So now let's have a look at how we can achieve that. If I come back to this login screen and hit login, we can see we have a blank list of to-dos with no to-dos in it. So it's not a very good to-do app so far. So to fix that now, let's go across into the main to-dos UI. And we can see here that we use a list view with a set of list tiles to show the task the user has. So one of the really nice things about Dart, we can use a really easy operator to add something to the end of this list every time it's shown on the screen. So to demonstrate that, what I'll do is I'll get rid of this to list on the end, and I will wrap this in a list or array operator. And obviously having done that, I have some warnings here. We're saying that we have children of this list, but then I'm specifying another list underneath it, and Dart doesn't really know what to do with that. But what we can do within Dart is we can actually use the spread operator, which is 3 dots, to say that I've got a list and I would like to include everything else from this list in it as well. So for this example, we can show all our tasks, and then underneath it, we can have another list tile always displayed, and we can call it create new task. Underneath that, we can just add a little on tap function as well. If we go to the app, we can see that we now have that clickable button there to create a new task. As well as that, I'll just trailing add an icon to that to make it stand out. And then we have our clickable button. So what we'd like to do now is when the user clicks on that, have a dialog box come up, have them enter the task in, and then have that task then persisted back to the database. So ideally, we'd have a widget that would capture the input and then return this back up to the calling object. So for that, and I'll create another stateful widget, and I'll call it create new task. So within here, this will be pretty simple. We'll just have a column, and within that column, we'll have some text, which will be what task do you want to create, and then we'll just have a text field. We also need to set up our input controller, text editing controller here, and reference that within the text field. And before finally adding in a button to specify what to do to give the user something to click after they've created that to do. So what we want to do is, because this dialog will show up for the user to interact with after they've entered in the to-do information and they hit OK, we want to close the dialog, but at the same time, we also want to pass the text of the to-do back to the thing that's actually called the dialog box. So how we do that is we call navigator, and then we get it within the context, and then we just pop it off the stack. Now what this pop operation does is essentially it tells the app to go back on the navigation stack. So if you go on page 1, page 2, page 3 and have a dialog box and you call pop, you'll go back to page 3, the page previous to it. But if you'd also like to pass some data back to page 3 at the same time, like what the to-do should be called, then we can call pop with an argument. So in this case, it's just going to be the text of what we had in the input box. So we'll save that. So coming back up now to the create new task button. So we'd like to show a dialog here, and we can use this in context there as well. And then we'll just use a dialog here, and within the dialog, we'll just call our create new task widget. So let's see how that looks. Create new task. Now, because the result of this text will come back in the future, we'll show the dialog, the user will type something in, and then hit save. You might have it where the create new task button is pressed, then the input is given, and then this particular bit of code will get the text back eventually in the end. Now, that's an asynchronous operation because it happens in the future. We get the text back at some point in the future. Now, what I used to do to overcome this was you would put then on the end and then deal with the value and so on and so forth. But sometimes you can wind up with these pretty long then statements as you're waiting for various things to complete. So what I do now instead, which is actually a little bit neater, is I come back up to this on tap statement here and I add async before it. And then I just go final result equals await show dialog, because show dialog is a future. You can't make all the functions that we call in these Flutter widgets asynchronous. For example, anything that takes part in building the tree or something like that can't ever be asynchronous. But some of the logical operations can, which is pretty handy. The other thing worth noting here is if we have a look at the result is actually dynamic. And the reason for that, and dynamic just basically means it could be anything. It could be a string, int, literally anything. For this particular result variable, there's no type safety to it. We could put it into a function, takes a string, takes an int, and obviously we'd only see the problem at runtime, which can be problematic. To overcome this, we can actually add a little type parameter to our show dialog function, because we know we're only ever going to get a string out of this function. And if we hover over this again, we can see that now it's a string, but it's a nullable string. It's a nullable string because we're always ever either going to get the text out of that input box, or the user is going to cancel out of it and we're going to get nothing or null. So within here, we'd like to check first that the result isn't null. So if the result isn't null, then we would like to use our block here to create that new to-do. So to facilitate that, we'll come back across into our to-dos block, and we can see that all we've really catered for is to load the initial to-dos. So within the event here, we'll add a new event, and we'll call it add to-do event. And that'll extend the to-dos event from above. The override, file, string, to-do text. Add that to the comparison. Also add that to constructor as well. And save that. We also need to hop back into our state here. And we also need to add the name of the currently logged in user to the state. And you'll see why in just a second. So within the block, we have our to-dos here, but we also want to return the username as well. The reason why is because now that we're adding to-dos to the list as well, we need to identify who the user is when they're on this page. So we have our event, we have our state as well. So within the block here, we'll go on, add to-do event, get event, emit, open the curly brackets. So within our add to-do event, the first thing we like to do is we'd like to get the current state. We'd like to get the current state, which includes the username of the user. So because we only have one successful state on this page, we can say state as to-dos loaded state. Then we'll make this function asynchronous, and we'll call it to-do service, and we'll go add task, events, to-do text, and we'll also bring in the name of the current user. Once that's done, because the new to-do has been added to the list, we'd like to reload the list with the new to-dos in it. And to do that, we can call the add function here to call the load to-dos event function. And again, specify the username of the user. So now if we come back to our UI, And this is the dialog, if the dialog function has returned, and if we've got a result from it. We like to call the block provider, context, todos block, call the add todo event function, and we'll include the result. And we can just save that now, and with our block set up as well. So hit create new task, text in, and then we can see we have a task added in. So we can create a new task and go new to do event, and hit save, and we'll keep getting more and more new tasks as we add them. So finally, let's take care of ticking these tasks off and seeing how we can do that. So to do that, come into the events here, and we'll make a new event. We'll call it class toggle todo state, and that'll extend the todos event class as well. We'll include the todo task for what to toggle, and we'll add that into the equality check. And then within our block, go on toggle todo state event emit, and again we'll just get the current state equals state as todos loaded state, and then we'll just call our to do service and we'll update the task. We'll have the task itself and we'll have the username. Originally when I did this, I added in a new parameter for completed to indicate whether the to-do would be completed or not. But in reality, a to-do can be toggled. If you're ticking it and unticking it, that would change its state. So we come back in this update task method. What I'll do is I'll get rid of that completed parameter on the end, is I'll instead make it the opposite value of whatever it is at the moment. So if it's false, it'll go to true. If it's true, it'll go to false. And that'll have a toggling effect. So I'll save that, come back to their block, add a semicolon there. Now after we've updated that task, we then want to load the to-dos event again for the current user who's logged in. So now the last thing we need to do to round that out is come back into our UI, and we need to find our little checkbox here. We finally need to add to this block provider of, we finally just need to send that event in the toggle to do state. I've actually called it the wrong thing. I should call that something else. Toggle to do event. That's better. And then here I can go e.task. So I've registered what to do when that checkbox is ticked or unticked. Come back to the app, use the account I've just created, log into it, create a new task, and ticking it and unticking it will work as well. We can see here that we have all our tasks here, and as well as that, we have this create new task button always at the bottom. And then if I tick these, we can see they get ticked as we would expect. If I can now come into here and set up a new username, I can register that. And in this case, we've already got a user with that name. So I'll have this error come back, which is appropriate. Change that to 2 and hit register. Then we've created a new user. So come into here and go task 1, task 2, task 3, and then tick tasks 2 and 3. When I log into the app again, we'll be able to see those tasks are still there and they're still ticked because they've been saved to the Hive database. So that's how you make a very simple to-do app using Bloc and Hive. If you have any comments about the video, be sure to let me know in the comments below. And as always, I've updated the sample on GitHub so you can clone it to your computer and use it locally. Again, I just want to say a huge thank you to Joe and Pancouch for being the Buy Me a Coffee supporters this month. Of course, if you need help with a certain aspect of Flutter, be sure to let me know in the comments below, and if I have time, I can make a video about that as well. But for now, thank you so much for watching.